Nathan was standing at my kitchen counter, the same counter where I had drunk coffee every morning for 19 years. And he looked at me with the particular patience that adults use when they believe they are explaining something obvious to someone who is being deliberately difficult. And he said, "Dad, you need to understand something. You can't keep acting like your retirement belongs only to you when Claire needs it more than you do." I didn't answer right away. I looked at him, my son, 44 years old, standing in my kitchen in his good jacket, the one he wore when he wanted to feel authoritative, and I noticed something he didn't notice. On the counter between us, about 18 inches from his left hand, sat a small brass carriage clock I'd finished repairing the previous afternoon. A mid-century French piece, not particularly valuable, brought in by a woman who had inherited it from her aunt and wanted it running again because it had sat silent on a shelf for 11 years, and that silence had started to bother her. The second hand was moving. Tick, tick, tick. Nathan kept talking. He said something about Claire's work situation, about obligations they hadn't anticipated, about the fact that I was retired now, and that retirement meant my expenses were different and my needs were simpler, and that surely I could see how the numbers made sense if I just looked at them clearly. And while he talked, I watched that second hand move. There is something about a clock that has been repaired and set running again after years of silence. The mechanism doesn't know it was broken. It doesn't carry the memory of being stopped. It simply does what it was built to do, 1 second at a time, without apology and without explanation. I have spent 51 years in the company of clocks. I understand their logic better than I understand most people. Then Nathan said the second thing. He said, "You're retired. What exactly are you contributing anymore?" And that was when I felt it. Not anger. Not the hot, immediate kind that makes you raise your voice and say things you spend the next decade regretting. Something quieter and considerably more serious. The feeling of a man who has just heard a sentence that will take him weeks to fully understand, and who knows, even in the moment, that he is not ready to respond to it yet. I looked at my son. I said, "I need to think about this." He seemed to interpret that as progress, which told me more than anything else he had said. He left about 20 minutes later after we talked about nothing in particular, the way people do after a conversation that has gone somewhere uncomfortable and neither party is ready to address what just happened. He said he'd call me in a few days. I told him that was fine. I stood at the door and watched his car back out of the driveway on Alderbrook Terrace, and I kept standing there for a moment after he was gone, looking at the quiet street and the November trees and the ordinary gray sky over Eugene, Oregon. Then I went back inside, sat down at the kitchen counter, and looked at the brass clock. Tick, tick, tick. And I thought, that was the moment I understood that my son wasn't asking for my money. He was asking me to prove that I still deserved to be his father. My name is Harold Mercer. I'm 76 years old. For most of my working life, I ran a small clock repair shop on the west side of Eugene, the kind of business that never made anyone wealthy, but provided something I considered more reliable than wealth, a daily reason to pay close attention to small things. I'm telling you this because the kind of person you become after 5 decades of repairing mechanical clocks is a person who looks for the small thing that is causing the large problem. A clock that loses 2 minutes per day is not fundamentally broken. It has one component, sometimes a spring under tension, sometimes a worn jewel bearing, sometimes nothing more than accumulated dust in a pivot hole, that is not doing precisely what it was designed to do. Find that one thing, correct it. The entire mechanism rights itself. I had spent 30 years applying that logic to machines. I had somehow never applied it to the relationship between me and my son. I want to be accurate about Nathan, because I have no interest in telling this story in a way that makes him a simple villain. He is not a villain. He is a complicated adult man who made a serious mistake in how he understood his own life, and some portion of that mistake was my fault in ways I didn't see clearly until long after the conversation at my kitchen counter. Nathan is my only son. He is 44 years old, married to Claire for 16 years now, working in regional sales management for a building materials company headquartered in Portland. He and Claire live about 2 hours north of me, which means I see them 4 or 5 times a year, more or less, depending on schedules and the particular rhythm of how close or distant we happen to be in any given season. He's not a cruel person. He has a humor that comes out quietly, the way my wife Dolores's humor used to come out, slow and dry and worth waiting for. He is organized and practical and sometimes so focused on solving a problem that he forgets to look at the person the problem is attached to. That last part is important. It is the mechanism that was slightly off, the small component that caused the larger misalignment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the months before Nathan came to my kitchen counter with his good jacket and his reasonable-sounding logic, because if I start with that conversation without giving you the context, the story doesn't make sense. And accuracy matters to me. It always has. About 8 months before that November afternoon, Nathan began asking questions about my finances. This was not, in itself, unusual. Over the years, he had occasionally asked general questions. Whether I was managing comfortably, whether the pension was sufficient, whether I had thought about this or that. I always appreciated it as a form of concern, the way adult children check in on parents who are getting older. I answered honestly, without much detail, because I have always believed that a man's financial life is his own private architecture. But the questions in those 8 months were different. The first one came over the phone in March. He asked, almost as an aside, how much I was bringing in per month between the pension and my Social Security. I told him a general figure. He said that sounded comfortable. I said I managed well. The conversation moved on. A few weeks later, in April, he visited for a weekend and we had dinner at the table, and at some point he asked whether I had ever considered what I might do with my savings long term. I said I had arrangements in place that satisfied me. He asked what kind of arrangements. I said the usual kind. Nothing dramatic, just a man who had been careful for a long time making sure things were ordered properly. He nodded, and the conversation moved on. In June, he called on a Tuesday evening and asked, with a casualness that I now recognize was practiced, whether I had ever thought about the idea that money sitting in accounts was in some ways money not being fully utilized. That was the phrase he used. Not fully utilized. I remember it specifically because it sounded like something he had been told rather than something he had thought of himself. I said I didn't follow his thinking. He said he just meant that sometimes money can do more good when it's in motion rather than sitting still. I said, clocks don't run better when you add extra parts, Nathan. They run best when every part is doing exactly what it's meant to do. He laughed. I thought the conversation was over. It was not. What I understand now, looking back at those months with the particular clarity that arrives after something significant has happened, is that Nathan was building toward something. He was gathering information, not duplicitously, I don't believe that, but with the particular purposefulness of a man who has already arrived at a conclusion and is now assembling the supporting evidence. He had already decided that my retirement income was a resource that existed within the family structure rather than exclusively within my own life. He had already decided that. He was simply confirming the numbers before asking the question. And here is what I find most difficult to say. Even now, even with the distance of several months between me and that kitchen counter conversation, I didn't see it coming. Not because I am naive. I'm 76 years old, and I have dealt with enough complicated people and complicated situations to have developed reasonable instincts about when something is heading somewhere I won't like. But I didn't see this coming from Nathan, because I had spent 44 years learning that Nathan was a person I could trust with my honest answers, and I had never revised that assumption. That was my piece of the mechanism that wasn't working correctly. I had kept updating my image of Nathan the adult based on my memory of Nathan the younger man, without accounting sufficiently for the ways that comfortable patterns can become assumptions, and assumptions can become expectations. And expectations, if they go unchallenged long enough, can start to feel like facts. When he finally made the request, the direct one in September, sitting at the same kitchen counter, he presented it with all the reasonableness of a man who has rehearsed the conversation and anticipated the objections. He and Claire were under financial pressure. He laid it out with precision, obligations that had accumulated, expenses that had exceeded projections, a window of several months during which things would be difficult before they stabilized. He said he wasn't asking me to solve everything. He was asking me to contribute a portion of my monthly income, he named a specific figure, for somewhere between 4 and 6 months until their situation corrected itself. He presented it as a loan. He used the word loan. I noticed that he did not specify a repayment date, a repayment structure, or an interest rate, all of which are things you specify when you actually mean loan, as opposed to using it as a softer word for something else. I said I needed to think about it. He became quiet, in a way that told me he had expected a faster answer. Then he said, "Dad, I don't understand what there is to think about. You have the money. We need it. That's a solvable equation." I said, "Most things that look like simple equations have components that aren't visible until you look more carefully." He said, That's not an answer. I said, I know. I told you I need time to think. And then came the part that I have replayed more times than I can accurately count. He put both hands flat on the counter and looked at me and said, Dad, you need to understand something. You can't keep acting like your retirement belongs only to you when Claire needs it more than you do. I stayed quiet. He said, You're retired. What exactly are you contributing anymore? There are sentences that arrive like a stone thrown into still water. The stone itself is gone quickly, disappeared below the surface, but the rings it creates keep moving outward for a long time afterward, reaching distances the stone itself never traveled. That sentence was a stone. I looked at my son. I said quietly, I need you to think about what you just said. He said, I didn't mean it like that. I said, I know you didn't. Think about it anyway. He left shortly after that. The departure was not hostile. There was no door slammed, no raised voice, no final declaration. He said he'd call me in a few days. I said that was fine. We stood at the front door for a moment with the particular awkwardness of people who care about each other and have just said something that neither of them knows how to undo yet. His car pulled out. I went back to the kitchen. The brass clock was still running, and I sat at that counter for a very long time, not making coffee, not reaching for anything, just sitting with my hands resting on the old wooden surface, thinking about a question that had not occurred to me until that exact moment. Had Nathan become this way recently? Or had I spent years, quietly and without realizing it, teaching him that this was acceptable? That was not a comfortable question. It was the right one. I went to bed around 9:30, which is earlier than usual for me. I lay in the dark in the room I had slept in for 19 years, in the house I had moved into after Dolores passed, and I decided I needed something smaller and more manageable, and I looked at the ceiling. The house on Alderbrook Terrace is modest. Single story, 3 rooms that I actually use regularly, a workshop attached to the garage where I continue to take in repair work occasionally, not because I need the money, but because stopping entirely felt like putting myself on a shelf. I keep it well. I repainted the front room 2 years ago. The garden in the back is not elaborate, but it is cared for. It is the kind of house that reflects a man who does not require much, but maintains what he has. I had bought it with my own savings and my own retirement income and my own deliberate choices, and I had never once described it to anyone as more than it was or less than it was. And lying there in the dark, I thought about Nathan's question. What exactly are you contributing anymore? I thought about contribution, about what the word actually means when you remove it from the context of usefulness to other people and hold it up on its own. A clock contributes by keeping accurate time. A gear contributes by transmitting force to the next gear in sequence. A mainspring contributes by storing the energy that drives the entire mechanism. What does a man contribute? Not what does he produce for others. What does he contribute? To his own days, to the people he loves, to the simple ongoing fact of his presence in the world? I didn't have a clean answer that night, but I knew, lying there in the dark, that I was going to spend the following morning looking for one. And I knew something else, with a certainty that was quieter and more durable than anger, that the following morning was going to tell me something about my own life that I had been postponing for a long time. The alarm on my nightstand was set for 7, the same as every morning. I was awake at 6:18. I didn't reach for the alarm. I got up, made coffee, and walked into the workshop. And what I found there, in an old notebook I had not opened in over 2 years, began to change the shape of everything I thought I understood about the last decade of my life. The workshop smells like machine oil and cedar and something older that I've never been able to name precisely. A combination of decades of small metal parts and worn leather and the particular stillness of a room where careful work happens slowly. I built the shelving myself when I moved in, installed proper lighting along the workbench, organized the tools in an arrangement that made sense to me and would make sense to nobody else. It is the room in my house that feels most completely mine, which is probably why I went there at 6:18 in the morning instead of sitting at the kitchen counter where Nathan's words were still in the air. The notebook was on the second shelf from the bottom, behind a row of spare mainsprings and labeled envelopes. It was not hidden there. I had put it there because that shelf was at a comfortable height when I was sitting on the workshop stool, and because the notebook belonged in the workshop the same way the tools did. It was a working document, not a personal journal. I had started keeping it about 12 years earlier, after Dolores passed, and I began managing everything myself for the first time in 38 years of marriage. Dolores had handled the household accounts. She had a system, a combination of paper records and a simple computer program she had taught herself. And after she was gone, I spent several disorienting weeks discovering that I had trusted her so completely with that part of our life together that I barely understood our own financial structure. I learned it. I rebuilt the system in my own way, which meant a physical notebook rather than a computer, because I think better with a pen in my hand than with a keyboard under my fingers. The notebook recorded income, expenses, any significant financial decisions, and notes I wrote to myself about reasoning, why I made a particular choice, what I expected from it, whether it had worked out the way I anticipated. I had not intended it to record anything about Nathan, but sitting on the workshop stool that morning with the November light just beginning to show through the small window above the bench, I turned pages and found that it did. The first entry that mentioned Nathan was from 9 years ago. He and Claire had encountered an unexpected expense, a repair to their house in Portland that their insurance had only partially covered. Nathan had called and explained the situation and asked whether I had anything available. I had transferred $1,200 to his account the following week. The notebook entry said, N and C, house repair shortfall, transferred $200, glad to help. I had written glad to help. I remembered meaning it. The next entry was about 7 months later. Nathan's car had needed a significant repair and the timing had been difficult. $800. The entry said N. Car repair? Helped out. Then there was a gap of about 14 months with no Nathan-related entries, which I noted because it told me something about the rhythm of those years. The assistants came in clusters, usually when something had accumulated to the point where he felt he had to ask. Then 3 entries in the same year, spaced about 4 months apart, a professional development course he wanted to take. A period when his commission structure at work had changed and the transition had been difficult. A medical expense that their insurance hadn't covered fully. The amounts varied. None of them individually was remarkable. Together, sitting on that workshop stool in the gray November morning, I added them on the back page of the notebook. I sat with that number for a while. Not because it made me angry, not because I wanted it back, not because I had any intention of presenting it to Nathan as evidence of anything, but because the number, sitting there in my own handwriting on the back page of a notebook I kept for accuracy, told me something that 12 years of individual transactions had kept hidden from me through the simple arithmetic of distance between events. The assistance I had given Nathan over that period was not individually extravagant. I had never said no. I had never felt burdened. I had written glad to help and helped out and good timing, and, of course, small annotations that reflected a genuine emotional state at the time of each transfer. But the pattern they formed together was a pattern I had never intended to create. I had become a regular feature of Nathan's financial life in a way that he had come to expect rather than appreciate. The notebook also told me something about myself that was considerably more uncomfortable than anything it said about Nathan. In the same years that I had transferred money to Nathan whenever he encountered a difficulty, I had made almost no entries recording money spent on myself that wasn't strictly practical. I had bought a used replacement motor for the workshop ventilation system. I had paid for a medical appointment. I had replaced the kitchen faucet when it began leaking. I had bought a new winter coat because the old one had reached the end of its reasonable life. Practical things, necessary things, things that no one could argue with. But there was almost nothing in 12 years of notebook entries that recorded Harold Mercer spending money on something. Because he wanted it, not because he needed it, not because someone else needed something from him, but simply because it would give him pleasure or comfort or the particular satisfaction of having something that made his days better. I had a clear memory of once standing in a small antique shop in Eugene, looking at a particularly fine set of Swiss watchmaking loops in a leather case, the kind of precision instrument that would have genuinely improved my restoration work, and putting them back on the shelf because they cost $400, and I had decided that was an indulgence I didn't need. That was 7 years ago. I had thought about those loops perhaps a dozen times since. I set the notebook on the bench and looked at it for a while without touching it. Then I said, out loud, to no one, to the quiet workshop and the labeled envelopes of spare mainsprings and the November light, no more automatic, yes. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It wasn't said with anger or with the particular satisfaction of a decision made in defiance of something. It was said the way you say something when you finally understand a mechanical problem you've been unable to diagnose for years, with a kind of relief that is almost tired, the relief of a man who has found the worn component and knows now what needs to be corrected. I closed the notebook, I did not call Nathan. I made a second cup of coffee and went back to the workshop and sat down at the bench and opened the movement of a clock I had been working on the previous day. A German bracket clock from the early 1900s, with a quarter chime mechanism that had been losing accuracy in a way that suggested a worn detent spring. I worked on it for 2 hours, carefully, in the way that repair work demands, fully present, fully attentive, thinking about nothing else. It is one of the things I am most grateful for in the life I built. The work requires complete attention. When I am at the bench, I am only at the bench. Nathan called 3 days later as he had said he would. I answered. He asked how I was doing. I said I was well. He asked if I had given any more thought to the conversation. I said I had thought about it quite a bit. He waited. I said, Nathan, I'm not going to contribute to your household income, not in the way you're describing. There was a pause. He said, Dad. I said, I'm not angry about the request. I want you to understand that, but my answer is no. He said, Can you at least tell me why? I said, Because I've done some thinking about how we've handled things over the years, and I've realized that I haven't done you any favors by always saying yes. And I haven't done myself any favors either. He said, That's not a reason. I said, It is a reason. It's just not the reason you were expecting. He said, What does that even mean? I said, It means that this conversation isn't only about the money you're asking for. It's about a pattern that's developed between us that I should have paid attention to a long time ago, and I'm paying attention to it now. Another pause, longer this time. He said, I don't understand what you're telling me. I said, I know. That's okay. You don't have to understand it right now. He said, Dad, this isn't like you. And that sentence right there, is the one that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from those weeks, because of the specific assumption buried inside it. This isn't like you. He meant it as an observation, possibly as a mild reproach, the kind of thing you say to someone whose behavior has deviated from a pattern you've come to rely on. But what he was actually saying, without knowing it, was that the Harold Mercer he knew was the one who said yes, the one who transferred money and wrote glad to help in a private notebook that Nathan had never seen and never asked about, the one who stood in an antique shop and put expensive loops back on a shelf because he had silently decided that his own wants were optional. He had built his understanding of his father around that version of me, and he was right that this new version was different. What he didn't know yet was that the new version was closer to accurate. I said, Maybe it isn't. Maybe that's the point. We said goodbye. The conversation ended without resolution, which felt uncomfortable in the way that all unresolved things feel uncomfortable, like a clock that's running but hasn't been set to the correct time. Everything is moving, but nothing is quite right. He didn't call for 11 days after that. And in those 11 days, I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I began taking care of Harold Mercer with something approaching the same diligence I had always applied to taking care of everyone else. It started small, because I am not a man who makes large gestures easily. The first thing I did was order the Swiss loops. I found a set online, similar to the ones I had seen in that antique shop 7 years ago, better quality actually, in a proper case, with an adjustable headband and 3 interchangeable magnifications. They cost $460. I sat at the kitchen counter with my laptop and my coffee, and I looked at the page for about 5 minutes, which is longer than I should have needed to make a decision of that size, and then I placed the order. They arrived 4 days later. I opened the case at the workbench and put them on and looked through them at the movement of a pocket watch I had been repairing for a retired professor from the university. The kind of intricate work where every pivot is a fraction of a millimeter, and the difference between good and exceptional is entirely a matter of what you can actually see. I could see everything. I sat at that bench for a long time, not doing anything in particular, just looking through those loops at the perfect tiny machinery of a watch movement, and I felt something that I recognized, after a moment, as uncomplicated pleasure. Not the pleasure of having done something useful for someone else, the pleasure of having acquired something that made my own work better for no reason other than that I deserved tools that matched my skill. That was the first thing. The second thing was the weekend on the Oregon coast. I had driven to the coast many times over the years, always with Dolores, always with a plan, a place to eat, something to see, a return time. After she passed, I had not gone once, not because I couldn't, because going to the coast alone had felt, without my examining it too closely, like something that required justification, like a luxury that a man in my situation needed a reason to claim. I drove out on a Thursday morning in late November and stayed 2 nights at a small inn in a town called Florence that I had always liked and never visited without Dolores. I walked on the beach both mornings in the cold, with my hands in my coat pockets and the Pacific doing what the Pacific does, presenting itself enormously, indifferently, without any interest in whether you found it impressive. I ate dinner both evenings at a restaurant with a window that looked out over the water, and I ordered what I wanted rather than what seemed reasonable for a man dining alone. And both nights I sat there longer than necessary because the view was worth sitting with. I drove home on Saturday afternoon feeling something I'm still working to describe accurately. Not happy, exactly. The word is too light for what it was. More like present. I was present in my own life in a way that I had not been for a long time, possibly for years. And the specific quality of that presence was that it had nothing to do with what anyone else needed from me. The channel you're watching right now exists for exactly these kinds of stories, the ones that seem to be about money or family conflict, but are actually about something much harder to name. If Harold's story is reaching you, if something in it feels like a conversation you've been waiting to hear, subscribe and stay with us, because this is the kind of place where those conversations happen honestly and without shortcuts. I had been home from Florence for 4 days when the email arrived. I should explain how I came to receive it, because the circumstances matter. Nathan had, at some point in the previous year, added me to a group email thread connected to a financial planning service he and Claire had consulted. I had forgotten I was on the thread. I received occasional emails from the service that I deleted without reading because they were clearly intended for Nathan and Claire's account and had nothing to do with my finances. But the email that arrived the Tuesday after I returned from Florence had a subject line that caught my attention before I could delete it, because it referenced a summary of projected contributions for the coming year and included a figure that I recognized immediately. It was close to the monthly amount Nathan had asked me to contribute. I opened the email. It was a planning document, the kind of summary a financial planning service sends when a client has updated their projected income to reflect an anticipated new source. The language was administrative and impersonal. It listed Nathan and Claire's projected household income for the following year, updated to include a line item described as family support contribution, recurring monthly, with a start date 3 months from now. I read that line 3 times. Then I sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the garden for a while. What I was looking at in that planning document was not evidence of malice. I want to be clear about that, because this is the part of the story that could easily become something simpler and angrier than it actually was, and I have no interest in telling it that way. What I was looking at was evidence of assumption. Nathan had not waited for my answer. Or rather, he had interpreted my answer. He had heard my silence in the days between the kitchen counter conversation and the phone call where I said no. And he had interpreted that silence as the beginning of a negotiation rather than the beginning of a decision. And somewhere in those days, he had spoken with the financial planning service and described my contribution as anticipated. And the service had incorporated it into their planning document. And the document had been emailed to the thread that included my address. He had already planned around a yes he hadn't received. He had not asked Claire whether Harold had agreed. He had told her, or told the planning service, as though the agreement were already in place. That distinction is the mechanism I keep returning to when I think about those months. Not that he wanted help, not that he asked, but that he had already incorporated my answer into his plans before I had given it. A request leaves room for another person's choice. What I was looking at in that planning document was not a request. I closed the email. I did not call Nathan that day. I did not call him the next day either. I went to the workshop and worked on the bracket clock and the pocket watch and a small anniversary clock that had come in the previous week. And I let the days pass with the particular patience of a man who understands that some conversations cannot be rushed without becoming something other than honest. And while I waited, I continued taking care of Harold Mercer. I bought the better chair for the workshop, a proper drafting chair with adjustable height and lumbar support, because I had spent years sitting on a stool that was adequate and had decided that adequate was no longer the standard I was applying to my own comfort. I had dinner at an Italian restaurant on the east side of Eugene that I had walked past hundreds of times and never entered because it looked expensive, and I had never had an occasion specific enough to justify it. I went alone on a Wednesday evening and sat at a table by the window and had the lamb and a glass of wine and dessert, and the bill was $68. and I paid it without performing the internal arithmetic I had performed every other time I had considered going somewhere like that. I was contributing to Harold Mercer's life. That was what I was doing. And something about doing it consistently, without fanfare, without explaining it to anyone, without seeking permission for my own habits, something about that quiet accumulation of small choices made for my own benefit was changing the quality of my days in a way I hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully articulate. I felt less like a resource, more like a person. That may sound like a small distinction. It is not. Nathan called on a Friday evening, 16 days after our last conversation. His voice had a different quality than it had in September or in the previous phone call. Less organized, less prepared. He said, Dad, Claire told me I should call. I said, is that the only reason? A pause. He said, no. I said, all right. He said, I don't understand what's happening between us, and I don't know how to fix it if I don't understand it. I said, I know. He said, can you help me understand? And I noticed the word he used. Help. Not tell me. Not explain yourself. Not give me an answer. Help me understand. It was a small thing, but I have spent 51 years knowing that the smallest component is often the one that determines whether the entire mechanism works. I said, yes, but not on the phone. Come to Eugene. He said he would come the following Saturday. I said that was fine. What I didn't tell him was that I had also, in those 16 days, received a phone call from Claire. A separate conversation that had told me something important about the gap between what Nathan had described to her and what had actually happened at my kitchen counter. And that conversation had changed the shape of what I was planning to say on Saturday, in ways that Nathan wasn't prepared for. Claire called on a Wednesday afternoon, 9 days before Nathan's Saturday visit. I was at the workbench when the phone rang, working on the quarter chime mechanism of the German bracket clock that had been giving me trouble for 2 weeks. I had finally found the worn detent spring, exactly where I had suspected it was, in a place that required removing 4 other components to access, which is the particular frustration of complicated mechanisms. Everything protecting the problem from being solved. I set down my tools and answered. She identified herself immediately, which I appreciated. No preamble, no softening, just, Harold, it's Claire. Is this an okay time? I said it was. She said, I wanted to call you separately from Nathan. I hope that's all right. I said, I appreciate it. There was a brief pause, the kind that tells you someone has prepared what they want to say and is deciding whether the prepared version is still the right one now that the conversation has actually begun. Then she said, Nathan told me that you refused to help us and that you didn't really explain why. And I've been sitting with that for a couple of weeks, and something about it hasn't felt right to me. I said, what part hasn't felt right? She said, the part where you didn't explain why. Because in 16 years of knowing you, Harold, you have always been someone who explains your reasoning. You're the most methodical person I have ever met. And a man like you doesn't suddenly stop explaining himself without a reason. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, Claire, did Nathan tell you what he said to me at the kitchen counter? She said, he said he made the case for why our situation was difficult and why your contribution would help. I said, did he tell you all of what he said? Another pause, longer. She said, I'm getting the feeling he didn't. I said, he told me I was retired and asked what I was contributing anymore. And he told me that my retirement didn't belong only to me. The silence that followed that was different from the previous pauses. It was the silence of someone absorbing something that reorganizes several things they thought they understood. She said, Harold? I said, I'm not telling you this to create a problem between you and Nathan. I'm telling you because you called me and asked an honest question, and you deserve an honest answer. She said, I didn't know he said that. I said, I know you didn't. She said, we didn't discuss it that way. When we talked about approaching you, we talked about it as asking for help from family, not in those terms. I said, I believe you. And I did believe her. That was the important thing. Claire was not the architect of what had been said at my kitchen counter. Nathan had arrived with a plan that was theirs together, but the specific words, the ones about contribution, about what I was still providing, about my retirement not belonging to me, those had come from Nathan and the pressure of a conversation that wasn't going the way he expected. People say things under pressure that reveal the shape of what they actually believe. That is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And explanations matter if you're trying to understand a mechanism rather than simply identify who broke it. Claire said, "Can I ask you something directly?" I said, "Please." She said, "Is there a version of this where we can fix it?" I said, "There's always a version where things can be fixed. The question is whether the people involved are willing to do the specific work that particular repair requires." She said, "What does that mean for Nathan?" I said, "It means he needs to understand the difference between asking his father for help and expecting his father to provide. Those are two different things. One of them leaves room for me, the other one doesn't." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to talk to him." I said, "I know you will. That's why I answered honestly." She said, "Goodbye." I said goodbye. I set the phone down and went back to the bench and looked at the bracket clock movement for a while without touching it. The worn detent spring was sitting in a small tray to my left, next to the 4 components I had removed to access it. A replacement was on order, due to arrive Thursday. Once it arrived, the repair would take about 40 minutes, and the clock would run correctly for another several decades if it was maintained properly. Some repairs are like that. They require patience and the right part, and the willingness to disassemble things carefully before you can put them right. I thought that was probably true of more than clocks. Saturday arrived with the particular quality of early December mornings in Eugene. Cold and clear, the kind of day that makes everything look sharper than it actually is, every outline precise against a pale sky. I'd been up since 6, which was usual. I'd made coffee and had gone to the workshop, and I installed the replacement detent spring in the bracket clock and tested the chime mechanism 4 times to confirm it was running correctly. It was. I set the clock on the shelf above the workbench, wound it, and listened to it run for a few minutes. The quarter chime sounded clean and even, exactly as it should. I had spent 3 weeks on that repair. The woman who brought it in had inherited it from her late husband, who had received it from his father, who had bought it in Germany in the 1950s and carried it home as part of his household when he emigrated. It had crossed an ocean. It had sat in 3 different living rooms. It had measured ordinary moments and significant ones with the same indifferent accuracy, and now it was running again, and I was the one who had made that possible. I am telling you this because the clock was still running when Nathan arrived at 10:15, and I want you to understand the specific emotional geography of that morning. I was calm. I was not performing calm. I was actually calm the way you are calm when you have done a difficult thing correctly and there is nothing left to dread about it. Nathan knocked rather than using the door, which he would normally just open, because I had told him years ago he didn't need to knock. The fact that he knocked told me that the conversation with Claire had changed something about how he was approaching the morning. I let him in. He looked tired. Not the tired of bad sleep, though probably that too, but the deeper tired of someone who has been carrying a thought they can't put down. He was wearing ordinary clothes, no good jacket this time, and he had his hands in his pockets when he came through the door, which was a posture I recognized from years ago, from times when he was younger and had done something he needed to account for and didn't quite know how to begin. I said, "Coffee's made." He said, "Thanks, Dad." We sat at the kitchen counter, the same counter where this had all started, and I poured 2 mugs and set one in front of him. And for a minute neither of us said anything. The brass carriage clock was still on the counter, still running. Nathan looked at it. He said, "Is that the one you were working on last time I was here?" I said, "Yes, finished it that same afternoon." He nodded. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug the way people do when they want something solid to hold. Then he said, "Claire told me what you told her." I said, "I know." He said, "I've been thinking about it since Wednesday." I said, "Good." He said, "I don't understand why I said it." I looked at him. I said, "I think you do understand. I think it's uncomfortable to understand it, which is a different thing." He was quiet. I said, "Nathan, I'm going to tell you something that I've been working out for the past several weeks, and I need you to listen to all of it before you respond. Not because I'm lecturing you, because if I stop in the middle, you'll answer the part you heard and miss the part that matters." He said, "Okay." I said, "When I went through my old financial notebook the morning after you were here last, I found 12 years of entries, the money I sent you when things were difficult. Amounts that were manageable on their own, but together added up to something I had never looked at as a total. And I want to be clear, I don't regret any of it. When I sent that money, I meant what I wrote. I was glad to help. He started to say something. I said, "I'm not finished." He stopped. I said, "What I found in that notebook wasn't evidence against you. It was evidence about me. I found 12 years of a man who had decided, without examining the decision, that his own wants were optional, that his comfort was secondary, that keeping money available for you was more important than spending it on his own life. I found a man who had never once, in 12 years, made a notebook entry about something he bought for himself that wasn't strictly necessary. And I realized that I had taught you something I never intended to teach you." Nathan's hands tightened slightly around the mug. I said, "I taught you that my yes was automatic, that when you had a difficulty, I was part of the solution before you even finished explaining the problem. And when something becomes automatic, it stops being seen as generosity. It becomes part of the expected structure of things. And that is not your fault. That is something I allowed to develop by never examining it." He said, "Dad," I said, "let me finish." He nodded. I said, "The thing that hurt me," and I'm using that word deliberately because it's accurate, "was not that you asked for money. It was what you said when I didn't answer quickly enough. You asked me what I was contributing anymore, and what that sentence told me was that somewhere along the way you had started measuring my value by my usefulness to you. And I have spent 76 years being careful, being responsible, building a life that was quiet and decent and mine, and I will not accept being measured that way. Not by anyone, and not by you." The kitchen was very quiet. The brass clock ticked. Nathan looked at the counter for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes had the particular quality of a person who is holding something difficult and has decided not to look away from it. He said, "I didn't mean it the way it sounded." I said, "I know you didn't mean it the way it sounded. That's what makes it more serious, not less. You didn't choose that sentence carefully. It arrived because it was already there. Because some part of you had already been thinking of me in those terms and just hadn't said it out loud until the conversation went somewhere frustrating." He didn't argue with that. He sat with it. And that, his willingness to sit with it rather than defend against it, was the first genuinely hopeful thing that had happened since the September afternoon he stood at my counter in his good jacket. I want to stop here for a moment, because what I need to say next is the part of this story that I believe matters most, and I want to say it carefully. When Nathan finally spoke again, he said something I had not expected and could not have prepared for. He said, "Dad, when did I stop asking and start expecting?" I looked at him. I said, "I've been trying to figure out the exact moment. I don't think there was one. I think it was gradual. The way a clock drifts, not a sudden failure, just a slow accumulation of small inaccuracies that nobody corrects until the time is significantly wrong." He said, "And I never noticed." I said, "Neither did I, not until I had a reason to look." He said, "What do I do with that?" And here is where I had to make a choice about what kind of father I wanted to be in that moment. Because there was a version of the answer that was satisfying in the short term. The version where I itemized everything, where I made the accounting clear, where I established the precise terms of a corrected relationship and language that left no room for further misunderstanding. But I have repaired enough complicated mechanisms to know that forcing components into position damages them. What holds, over time, is alignment that arrives naturally from correcting the underlying problem. I said, "You start by understanding that asking for help is a different thing from expecting it. A request is something you make from an honest position. Here is my situation. Here is what would help me. I understand that you have your own situation and your own choices, and I am asking, not assuming. An expectation is what you have when you've stopped leaving room for the other person's choice. When you come to me already having planned around my answer." He went very still. I said, "Nathan." He looked at me. I said, "I know about the planning document." He opened his mouth. I said, "I'm not angry about it. I was for about a day. Then I decided that being angry about it was less useful than understanding what it told me. And what it told me was that you had convinced yourself that a yes from me was so certain that you incorporated it into your plans before you had it. That's not malice. That's a pattern that developed because I never gave you reason to expect anything different." He said, "Dad, He stopped. He tried again. He said, "I didn't think of it as assuming. I thought of it as, I don't know, planning optimistically." I said, I understand that, and I need you to understand something in return. Planning your financial future around your father's retirement income is not optimism. It is the transfer of your security onto someone else's resources, and it is not something I am willing to be. He was quiet for a long time after that. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you already know that the stories we tell here are not about perfect families or simple resolutions. They're about real adults navigating real difficulties with the imperfect tools that years of living together provide. If Harold's story is saying something that matters to you, something about worth or expectation or the quiet courage it takes to stop being automatically available, leave a comment. Tell me what you took from it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the conversations on this channel are worth being part of, and every single story we tell here is one that deserves to be heard. Nathan eventually said, "I'm sorry, Dad." Not a prepared apology. Not the organized version of remorse that arrives with explanations and context designed to soften it. Just those 3 words, said quietly, with the particular weight they carry when they come from someone who has actually understood why they're necessary. I said, "I know." He said, "I don't know how to fix the planning document situation. It's already in there." I said, "You tell the planning service that the anticipated contribution was an error and have it removed." "That's a phone call, Nathan. 15 minutes. He nodded. I said, "And then you and Claire figure out your situation the same way every adult figures out their situation, without building it around someone else's retirement." He said, "That's going to be difficult." I said, "Yes. Adult life is frequently difficult. You manage it. That's what you do." He almost smiled at that. A small thing, barely visible, but I caught it because I know my son's face and I know where his humor lives. I said, "I'm not disappearing, Nathan. I want you to understand that. I love you. That is not conditional on any of this. But I am changing some things about how I've been operating, and some of those changes are going to be visible to you, and I need you to understand that they're not punishments." He said, "What kind of changes?" I said, "I bought a good chair for my workshop. I went to Florence for a weekend. I had an expensive dinner by myself on a Wednesday because I felt like it. I bought a set of loops I should have bought 7 years ago." He looked at me. I said, "I have been treating my own wants as optional for a long time. I'm not doing that anymore, and I need you to be the kind of son who is glad about that rather than the kind who interprets it as resources being withheld." He said, "That's fair." I said, "It's not about fair. It's about accurate. I have a life. It's mine. I built it carefully, and I intend to live in it fully for whatever time I have left. And you are part of that life, an important part, the most important part. But you're not the organizing principle of it." "I am." He sat with that for a while. Then he said something I did not expect, and that I have returned to many times since. He said, "Mom would have said the same thing to you if the situation were reversed." I looked at him. He said, "She would have told you that you had a right to your own life and that loving her didn't mean surrendering it." I said, "She would have." He said, "She used to say that to me after she passed, and I was not handling it well for a while. She had written me a letter, before she went. I never told you that." I said, "I didn't know." He said, "She said that loving someone means wanting them to be fully themselves, not just available. She said she'd spent 38 years making sure you knew that." I sat very still. He said, "I forgot that somewhere. I think I got so focused on my own situation that I forgot that you were a person with your own situation. And that's..." He paused. "That's a significant thing to forget about your father." The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. The brass clock ticked on the counter between us. I said, "Dolores was a wiser person than either of us." He said, "Yeah." We sat with that for a while, and the sitting was different from the silence earlier in the morning. Not uncomfortable, not the silence of 2 people managing distance between them, the silence of 2 people who have said the difficult things and are now in the space that opens afterward, where nothing needs to be filled immediately. I poured more coffee. He didn't leave until early afternoon. We talked about other things. His work, a project I was considering in the workshop, the garden, the Oregon coast, and why I should have gone years earlier. Ordinary conversation, the kind that had become slightly unfamiliar between us in those weeks and was now finding its way back. Not perfectly, not without the awareness of what had happened, but genuinely. Before he left, he stood at the door the same way he had stood at the beginning of the morning, hands in his pockets. He said, The planning document will be corrected by Wednesday. I said, good. He said, and Dad, the next time I need help, if I need help, I'm going to ask. Not assume? I said, that's all I want. He nodded. He left. I stood in the doorway the same way I had stood in September, watching his car back out of the driveway on Alderbrook Terrace, but the quality of the watching was entirely different. In September, I had stood there with the weight of a conversation I didn't know what to do with. Now I stood there with the particular lightness of something that had been correctly repaired. Not perfect. Repaired. There is a difference, and the difference matters. A clock that has been repaired is not a new clock. It carries the wear of its years, the evidence of having run and stopped and run again. But it keeps accurate time. It does what it was built to do. And if it is maintained properly, with attention and patience and the willingness to address problems when they are small rather than waiting until the mechanism fails entirely, it runs for a very long time. Several months have passed since that December Saturday. Nathan calls more regularly now. The calls are different, shorter sometimes, less loaded, the way conversations are when they don't have unfinished business underneath them. He asks about the workshop and what I'm working on. I ask about Portland and how things are going. We talk about Dolores sometimes, which we had stopped doing for a while and which I had missed without fully acknowledging that I missed it. He and Claire are managing their situation. They made adjustments. The kind of practical, unglamorous adjustments that adults make when they stop waiting for an external solution and start building one themselves. Nathan called me in January to tell me they'd worked things out without needing the contribution he had asked for. He said it with a specific tone, not pride, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The tone of a man who has solved a problem himself and discovered that the solving built something in him that a rescue would not have. I said I was glad. I meant it. The brass carriage clock is still on the kitchen counter. It runs perfectly. I wind it every Sunday morning while the coffee brews, which takes about 40 seconds, and has become part of the ritual of Sunday in a way that gives me a particular quiet satisfaction. The woman who brought it in for repair, the one whose aunt had left it to her, came to collect it in December and stood in my workshop for a few minutes listening to it run, and she said it sounded exactly as it must have sounded when it was new, and I told her that was the goal. She asked how long it would keep running. I said, indefinitely, if someone paid attention to it. She smiled and carried it home. The Swiss loops are on the bench every day now. The chair is exactly right for the work. I have been to the Oregon coast twice since November. Once in December, once in February, both times alone, both times for as long as I wanted to stay. I have made notebook entries in those months that look different from the previous 12 years of entries. Still methodical, still accurate, still tracking the things that matter. But the entries now include things I have done for myself, money spent on my own life, choices made because they made my days better. I have not stopped loving my son. I have not stopped being his father. I have simply stopped confusing those things with being available for whatever he needed, automatically, before he even finished asking. There is a sentence I have come back to many times since that December morning. What exactly are you contributing anymore? I used to hear that sentence with the particular sting of a man who had been reduced to a smaller version of himself by the person who should have known him best. I hear it differently now. Now when I hear it, I think about the workshop and the loops and the Oregon coast and the chair in the Italian restaurant on a Wednesday evening and the 2 cups of coffee Nathan and I drank at the kitchen counter while we said the difficult things in the comfortable silence that came after. I think about Dolores' letter, which I have not read, that belongs to Nathan, but which said something that was true for 38 years and is still true now. Loving someone means wanting them to be fully themselves, not just available. I'm contributing exactly what I should be contributing. I am contributing Harold Mercer, fully present, fully himself, in his own life, on his own terms, for the first time in a long time. That is what a 76-year-old man with a workshop and a notebook and a shelf full of running clocks and a son he loves can offer the world. It turns out to be quite enough. If this story stayed with you, if something Harold said landed in a place you recognize, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of this hit closest to home. Was it the notebook? The planning document? The moment Nathan finally asked instead of assumed? Tell me. Every comment here is a real conversation, and I read all of them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Because every story on this channel is told with the same honesty and the same care that Harold gave to every clock that came through his workshop door. The next story is already waiting, and you don't want to arrive late.